and welcome to the first installment of SCAI's new video series entitled Pioneers in Interventional Cardiology. My name's Jeff Marshall. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia at Northside Hospital, and my colleague and co-director here is Dr. Skip Anderson from the University of Texas in Houston, Texas. Pioneers in Interventional Cardiology is a video series that seeks to highlight esteemed leaders in the field of interventional cardiology, as well as engage them in just friendly discussions that touch on important historical moments. Today, we're honored to be joined by Dr. Spencer King and Dr. John Douglas, both of Emory University in Atlanta, two of the real luminaries with a great wealth of knowledge and rich stories, I think, of the earliest days in interventional cardiology. I think everybody knows that their third partner in the Three Musketeers was Dr. Andreas Gruentzig. Can you tell us what it was like in the early days with three absolutely great interventionalists all working together in the same lab? Are there any things you remember about that or any stories that you'd like to share, especially with younger interventionalists?
I don't know how great we were when we started out, John, when we brought Andreas over, but probably wouldn't have considered ourselves great at that moment, and maybe he wouldn't either, having just done whatever, 869 or something like that. But yeah, those were interesting days, John. You probably can remember better than I can. First, remember when John and I started before Andreas came. I mean, we went over there and boned up on it, how you do, see one, do one, that sort of thing. But so we were pretty tickled when he finally decided to come join us.
We were surprised, actually. I do remember going over and watching the cases, and it was kind of a sense of camaraderie. We were all sitting up in this auditorium, and he would be doing the case over in the cath lab in the hospital, and it was a bit scary, and it was the equipment was pretty crude back in those days, and equally crude when we started at Emory. We had a lot of failures. You would expect to have 5% of the cases not turn out very well, and if you were getting more aggressive, maybe 15% would not turn out well. So it was pretty tense in those days.
And some of those not turning out well were not, you just finish the case and say, well, can you do it? About 5% or so were headed to the OR urgently.
And did that bother the surgeons to get those calls?
On Friday afternoon, yeah, a lot.
Well, we were lucky in a way because we had a period of several years when our surgeons were just starting out, doing good work. We were sending them patients. And so we did have a history with Ellis Jones and Joe Craver, and we had supported them. But at the same time, we were then starting doing the angioplasty and having all these failures. And Spencer's right, they were not completely happy with that.
Part of the camaraderie, if you can call it that, at least getting on with each other, had to do with Andreas had gotten to know not only us, but the surgeons. In fact, he came over the year before. We had a meeting down in Kiowa Island, and he had met our surgeons, and he was under such pressure in Zurich, where people were really not, at least the people in charge of him were not happy with what he was doing. The surgeons were fine with it, but when he came over, I think the reason he came to Emory in part had to do with the fact that he felt more comfortable dealing with us and with the surgeons than he had where he had been or other places that he might have gone.
So how was cath conference the next morning after somebody went urgently to the OR? What kind of discussions ensued then?
The failure rate, was so high that it would, just thinking back on that, it seems almost unacceptable that you would have at least 5% failure rate, and then or maybe those would be high risk failures. And then maybe 15% would be the total failure rate. That's would be pretty unacceptable. It surprises me that, you know, the whole system accepted that and we moved forward. I'm a little bit surprised reflecting on it.
A major part of things those days were learning how to get out of trouble because you got into trouble so often. I watch cases today and I say, well, they're kind of routine, you know, you don't learn anything. Yeah, there was a lot of trouble to be gotten out of. And talking about, maybe we can finish up talking about controversies, but there were controversies primarily related to the anesthesiologists. Cardiac anesthesia those days was not happy at all with the case going bad. You know, they'd have to quit what they're doing, do something else. So we had more serious discussion with them than we did with the surgeons.
Fortunately, at Emory, the anesthesia group was extremely talented, and they were not happy, you know, that we were dumping all these cases on them. But they did a great job, and they recruited a number of folks so that, you know, they weren't short staffed. They had a number of anesthesia attendings that were just superb, and that was a saving grace.
When do you recall that they first were able to do the freeze frame videotape? Because, you know, prior to that freeze frame coming, there were no guiding shots, no roadmap shots in order to help you with your imaging. You must have worked in those days. Do you recall the changeover to when the freeze frame came?
Well, Skip, I remember when there was not only no freeze frame, but no active video. There was back in the just before I went into the cath lab in training with Bob French, they had an image intensifier that only one person could look at, and they have to wear the dark glasses and look at it. Those were before we started doing coronary arteriograms, and so somebody would have to look, and then Bob French would draw a picture of the expected direction that the contrast media might go, and shoot it in the right ventricle, see if it went into the pulmonary artery or into the aorta, and he'd have somebody look and say, did it go this way or this way? So there were a lot of things that were pretty really hard to deal with. Some of the equipment in those days, but once we I don't know, freeze frame. I mean, that's you're remembering something. I don't know when that came. Well, that was before we started doing angioplasty.
It was right about the same time, as near as I can figure. Right about the same time, the videotape, which was not a high quality image at all on videotape, the freeze videotape. It got much better when the digital imaging came along, but the videotape, and I can remember talking with other operators back in that era who had the videotape, who used to curse at the images. They were such poor quality, the videotape frames. But I think Emory had relatively higher quality.
One thing that happened that helped us a lot was the reimbursement to the hospital was they didn't really know how to set it. They set it relatively high, so the hospital, you know, was making quite a bit of money off of it, so they were willing to invest in better imaging, and so our cath labs were, you know, they were superb actually for that day and time.
So to that end,
You're forgetting about that CGR lab. Andreas had insisted that we get him a isocentric biplane. He thought this was going to be crucial. And there was one in the world at that time, and it was made by the company General Radiographique in Paris.
That's CGR.
CGR. And so we bought that thing. And let me tell you, it spent more time in the shop than anything else.
Well, fortunately, we had several labs, so Spencer and I did our best not to work in that lab.
So to that end about imaging and things, in 1981, y'all started the Emory demonstration course. Can y'all tell us a little bit about kind of how that started and any stories relating to those great courses y'all did in Wishcab Auditorium?
Right, that was a big promise to Andreas that we were going to continue these courses that he was doing in Zurich, where he had done 4 of them. So what we wanted to do was have in that very large auditorium, much bigger than anything in Zurich, we wanted to have 2 images up. And so we had these 2 10-foot back project TV images that were called high def in those days. I think it was the raster lines were like double the usual. There was nothing like high definition now, but it was like digital, but it was a lot better than we had anywhere else. And to get that, we ran a fiber optic cable from the cath lab all the way into the Woodruff building to project the video and the fluoroscopic images, and then the regular images came along as well. So we had one image of the people working in the lab, and the other image was what you saw in the lab. And often they were quite good. And sometimes I remember people in the audience would see things, and Andreas or I would have to go back and have a look and say, "Do you see that in the lab?" So it was projecting better in the auditorium, which had about 400 people in it, than it was in the cath lab. That was a necessary component of the whole recruitment process. We had to promise that we're going to continue those courses.
Do you remember any interesting happenings in those first few years of the demonstration courses, which really were, the very beginnings of the courses that we all now attend these days?
I had an interesting thing that happened. I had a short lady. We were doing a coronary procedure on her, and she was short and weighed about 220 pounds, something like that. So she fibrillated, and she sort of slid off the table. And so I was down on the floor defibrillating her. And there was, which was successful, fortunately. And then we had to decide what to do because, she had kind of taken had some head trauma slight. So we stopped the case, and this was like on a Thursday. And then so Saturday morning, we brought her back and did her case, as projected case. So that was one of the more strange things, most strange things that ever happened to me in the cath lab.
John and I remember things slightly differently. What I'd heard, and John has told me this, but it didn't really happen. But what I heard was this was like during the lunch break, and Andreas had a group of people who wanted to come over and see the lab, and he was taking them into the lab and walked in, and head of the group saw John down on the floor with his patient defibrillated, and he turned around quickly and said, "Nothing to be seen here." But John tells me that is a myth, but
No, that's true, Spencer. That is absolutely true.
That's a great story. I'm going to tell you.
It was Jack Vogel, I think, that was leading the group.
Oh, Jack was there, yeah. Anyway, he said, "Oh, nothing to be seen here."
So one of our friends from Colorado was there. So he had taken a group over and brought them and was showing them the cath lab. We had some new equipment, and he was showing them that. And it was 6 or 8 people with a couple of industry folks as well. So quite a big group. And then I had the patient down on the floor, was defibrillating the patient, and they happened to come in, and Jack just turned right around and said, "Nothing to see here," ran over the guys and got them down the hall.
One story, of course, I remember vividly was during the first course. You mentioned 1981, it was in the spring. And so the last case of the course, Andreas said we ought to pick a case that, everybody should start with, because the room is full of people who've never done angioplasty. I mean, maybe a few did, And so Andreas was doing the case. I was an auditor moderating, and gave this big spiel about how if you don't start with the most difficult case. Start with something like this. It was a proximal LAD, type A looking lesion, just fine. So Andreas gives a little speech about how this should be the first thing to do. Puts the catheter in, blows up the balloon, deflates, artery dissects, closes immediately, patient fibrillates. I cut the transmission and then we carried on talking about it and said, well, I'm sure they'll take care of it. And I felt like ever since that maybe we saved a lot of lives that day, because a bunch of those people in the audience said, this is not for me. I'm never going to take up this crazy thing. But that was the last case, the ideal case that you should do. So it's kind of, did put in perspective. You never would plan such a case, but that things can go wrong even if you pick the ideal setting. Richard Myler used to come to these things, and Richard's famous slide was this sculptor was tapping on a statue he's building, and then the whole thing falls apart, and the caption was just one more tap. And now you talk about how to optimize the result. Your job has got to be you got to have it fully deployed stents, no issues. Like in those days, it was the opposite. It was like, do just enough, but don't do that thing that's going to end up in the OR in the next few months.
I think the volumes grew fairly quickly, and eventually Andreas had to start going to Crawford Long to do cases. Did you guys just totally consume the hospital?
We're doing, 1,400 cases a year, which seemed like a lot. That was, fairly early on. And the Emory was very supportive. We were extremely lucky, to have great, hospital support, great anesthesia, and superb cardiac surgery. So we were really lucky in so many respects.
During a lot of the time, he went down 2 days a week. He did he did peripherals, and I think he did more peripherals down there than he.
Yeah, well, I was just wondering if you guys just totally consumed the hospital beds, and that's why you had to branch out, or if they wouldn't give you more beds.
We were a small percentage of the hospital beds. I mean, we were doing how many angioplasties a day? 5 or 6, something like that, maybe on average.
Yeah.
So that was a lot in those days. Some days it'd be 8 or 10, but.
Well, how did you pick those early fellows? I mean, y'all were training really the first people, and Skip was certainly one of those early fellows. But how did you pick people to really help you start something that was so new? How did you select folks?
Well, I can say we were really lucky. We had, 50 applicants sometimes. It would not be at all unusual. And from the, best places around, these were the top guys. So we probably could have had twice or 3 times the number of people we selected and have really a great crop, So we were very fortunate in that regard.
Although in the beginning, I would say, sort of who was there, who stepped up. So that before we started having a lot of people that really, taking notice and wanted. Most of the people we trained, though, in those days were not fellows. Most of the people were, the fellows, of course, got trained a lot. But the way most people started was they would either come to our place or somewhere else. And for a while, they could scrub in, or they'd bring a patient or a couple of patients, and come and then scrub in on a case or 2 or 3. And some of them stayed for days, some stayed for, maybe 1 or 2 days, some stayed a little bit longer. But a lot of the people who, had finished, they were out in practice, cranked up and started doing all those people who came to the courses. Wanted to come back, and then not necessarily come just to our place, but go to somewhere where someone had done something in order to get not C1 and do1, but almost close to that, maybe C3 or 4, but see a week's worth at the course, go and do one with somebody else, do 3 or 4, and then you're off and running. You're back in your hospital and run up the shingle and say, I'm an angioplasty guy.
Yeah, that's true. And we got a number of cases that way. And some of our most difficult cases actually were brought by colleagues out around the state who had a case they thought maybe could be done, didn't want to do it in their hospital. So they would basically bring it to us. So it increased our patient difficulty, but gave us opportunities to see these difficult cases. And frequently, with new technology, rotablator, directional atherectomy, and stents, so stents didn't really come along until like the mid 80s, actually early 90s before really did much of it.
Well, you put the first one in, didn't you, John, in 87?
That was 87, yeah. 87.
What's the story behind that?
I think it was just a route, as I remember, it was an LAD, we were putting him in as a bailout procedure, and it was a bailout of an LAD, so it was nothing that it worked. It's nothing special. We recast the patient in one of the courses 10 years later, and what do you think we found?
Open.
And it looked pristine. It's a little bit remarkable how difficult the procedure was in the pre-stent era and how much easier it became with stents. I mean, and currently with the kind of equipment that's available and spurb stents and all the other things that have been learned, it's a entirely different, not very frightening procedure currently.
Yeah, we got to remember that the stents were not put in for anything to do with restenosis. Although we were studying restenosis in the animal lab and everything, the stents were there to solve that problem of 5% running to the OR, the CPR going on. And so it was how to bail them out. So that those first stents, 10 cases were to it was approved by FDA to put them in, but the patient would have to go directly to the OR after that and get a bypass to the vessel. So the stent was just to solve the acute closure problem until you could get to the OR. And then quickly after that, you got applied to the same reason, for the same reason. But the restenosis was not the driving feature. And we didn't know for a while, really, that stenting would be any better than just ballooning for restenosis.
Well, one thing that was pretty interesting is that for those initial patients, they had to undergo a recat 3-6 months later. So that you had a patient who had a failed angioplasty, got a stent, and they'd have to come back for a recat. And the surprising thing was frequently, in spite of the bypass being open, the stented site would be open as well. I was really surprised with that. You'd think the competitive flow would lead to closure on all of them.
John, you had the world's greatest experience there for a while with doing angioplasty in saphenous vein bypass grafts. And Emory had as an institution, had the world's largest experience. But, at that time, bypass grafts were kind of a contraindication, and the early data on doing angioplasty, balloon angioplasty in the grafts was not that favorable. What was it that made you think you could do better and start doing that? Was there one particular case that sort of sparked it?
Well, not particularly, but there are a couple of issues. One is whether you're going to dilate and stent a bypass graft, and that we found that you know, if you are stenting like an old bypass graft, you know, you're much more likely to have distal embolization. And we had a number of patients who we ended up finding early stenosis in the grafts, and those were animal hyperplasia did a little bit of a rough treatment of the graft, the vein graft itself. And so these early ones you could treat, you know, without any risk of distal embolization. So we had several hundred patients that were treated, of which about a third were pretty early after surgery, and we learned that was quite safe.
So do y'all remember any very early day kind of lighthearted incidents that occurred in the cath lab that y'all could share with young interventionalists kind of around the world?
You mean that we can actually tell?
Yeah, this doesn't have to be this. We're not going to X-rate it, but ones that you can tell us.
There are a lot. There are a lot of there are a lot of things in the cath lab. Out of the cath lab, the courses that we put on twice a year, all the time when Andreas was with us, and I think that's the focus of what we're trying to talk to you about. Andreas loved to party, and so we would put on a party at someplace. Once it was out at Stone Mountain, and once was up in the mountains. Sometime it was at the art museum, at all kind of places like that. Everything from country bands to black tie events, but had to be a party at the end of every course, and everybody came and had a lot of fun. So those were pretty cool things. As time went by, of course, a lot of what we were doing was trying to test out new equipment, try to find out what worked, working with the companies. One thing the folks might be interested in is that when we started, the catheters we were using were made by USCI, U.S. Catheter Company, and Snyder made the Gruentzig catheters in Europe. But then John Simpson company, ACS, started, and that was an interesting controversy. We were primarily working with USCI. Those catheters were called Gruentzig catheters. They did not have a wire through them. Those were fixed on the end, a fixed little wire. And so it was not an over-the-wire system. So that's what we started with, what everybody started with. But then John Simpson came with this over-the-wire system, which I found very surprising that he could do that, because Gruentzig's earliest catheters for the periphery also were over the wire. So how could this stand up to patent challenge? But they were able to get it going. And Jeff Hartzler, was the early adopter of the Simpson stuff and worked with that company a lot. So it kind of ended up with a Kansas City Emory battle about who did what, and one company supported us and one company the other. So USCI made a catheter they called the Probe. It was basically a guide wire with a balloon on it, almost very tiny, and it could get through anything. It would really, it wasn't that steerable, but it would get through a lesion. So I had gone out to Kansas City to give a talk on that catheter at Jeff Hartzler's course. And when I came back, Andreas, it was the only time I remember, he was very upset with me. He said, you're cavorting with the enemy. So a lot of people like to make a lot about these kind of internecine rivalries and all this kind of thing. And they did indeed exist, but by and large, they're overblown in the memory of mine.
One of the really interesting things that happened early on is Andreas decided he wanted to have a heart cath himself. So he, without telling anybody, he told two fellows he was working with that day, and So he told the fellows, "You're gonna do my heart cath. We're gonna do it right now." And so he hopped up on the table, had his heart cath done, and he was fortunately normal. And I hopped back off, and it was during a course. So that evening we had a function, and lo and behold, he comes to the function, an hour and a half after his heart cath. So a bit unbelievable.
He would not take his pants off and show us how blue his leg was, but he had a point. What his point he was trying to make, he thought we ought to cath normal people. I mean, people with no history of any kind of heart disease, to find out what is the normal anatomy, what was the normal extent of coronary disease in the population unselected. And so his idea that he proposed to me was that we should contact CNN, Coca-Cola, all kind of Delta Airlines, and offer the CEOs and everybody a free care. And by doing that, then that would other people would fall in line, and we'd get a lot of people. And so, we said, look, no, that can't happen. And so the next thing he does, he casts himself.
The first same day cath. He was a real luminary.
He gets Hall Whitworth to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, but also back at that time, wasn't that part of the controversy was that the catheters were getting smaller. They had the new 6 French, and they wanted to do outpatient cath. I remember you and Steve Clements set up that outpatient cath lab over in the basement of the clinic. And I think, wasn't there some of this desire to show that these outpatient caths could be done quickly and smoothly and easily with these smaller catheters?
Yeah. That certainly was the idea of having that lab. I mean, a lot of people kind of were doing outpatient cath by that time, but that was the idea of having it in an outpatient building, not in the hospital. Yeah.
Is that outpatient lab still there?
No, it's not. In fact, that lab got moved. I've just recently learned that lab got moved into a new suite. There's a new suite of state-of-the-art labs, hybrid rooms and robotic and surgery and everything all together. But we just had a look at that. So the old labs, well, I'll tell you the story. John and I were over there. They had a ceremony to open up these new labs, and the first case was done today. Today being what is it, the 18th of
March 8th.
So today was the first case in the new labs, and the old labs that we built back in the early 70s were decommissioned today. So those labs that were the state of the art 50 years ago now are extinct, and no one is crying about it, I don't think. But I did go over and take a photograph, John, of the last day of the lab.
We did a lot of cases in those old labs. I'll tell you, we were lucky, having very supportive hospital, not just and they would allow us to do a lot of cases and support us, and we were just very fortunate, I think, with that setup.
It served us well.
So in today's world, there's a lot of talk about work-life balance, and I'm just wondering what kind of balance there was in the early days when y'all were just starting this out.
How about zero?
Zero balance, I tell you. It was incredible. We would go over there, especially when I won't go over there every other night and every other weekend. And we'd show up there early in the morning and get home late in the evening. And our wives were always beating on us, for missing supper. And it was, but it was so much fun. We, working with the great fellows we had was just, terrific, and things tended to work out favorably, you know, the better equipment and good labs and wonderful, cath lab techs and nurses, and it was a wonderful environment to work in.
I'll tell you one story to illustrate how committed the fellows were. Steve Ellis, who everybody knows, was one of our most aggressive fellows in putting in abstracts and doing research while he was with us. And so the way we did it, of course, in those days, the randomized trials hardly existed. I mean, we did some very early. The first randomized trial in interventional cardiology was Coumadin versus aspirin, angioplasty. And that was first authored by Andreas's second wife, as a matter of fact. But anyhow, Steve, the way we do the follow-up is we had to get on the phone and call people and do phone follow-up. Skip remembers as well.
Oh, yeah.
And so I walked in one night up there on the 6th floor and opened the door, and Steve Ellis's wife was sitting there, one hand on the telephone talking to a patient, the other arm cradling her baby who was nursing. I went out immediately. I said, Steve, this is beyond the pale. Your wife has been put to work to, so Sandy was in there calling patients and attending to her maternal duties at the same time. Talk about dedication.
The dedicated bunch, it sounds like.
And the marriage lasted, surprisingly, till this day.
Anything else on that, John, that you recall?
Not particularly. It was just, well, it was a great time had by all, and we were just blessed with these terrific young people, fellows and nurses and staff, and it was an awesome experience. And I remember my wife telling me, "You're crazy. You're over there all day long, and every other night they're called in, and every other weekend, and we can't go to the lake, you know, half the time because you're working. You need to reset your priorities." Remember, I was told that a number of times.
And how did it work out for the two of you?
We did fine.
You know, these stories you're asking us to tell, we're a lot better at it now because of Skip Anderson. Skip Anderson has put together, we had these newsletters that went out monthly. Andreas actually started it, and we continued it after he died for another 10 years or so. And so those newsletters are really the diary of our place during that time, because each month something would happen and you put it in there. So reading Skip's book, Skip has put this together in a book, and along with his commentary about those newsletters, and it is going back in time, Skip, and we appreciate your work on that very much.
I don't want to end really on a somber note, but we all know that Andreas died tragically in an airplane crash in 1985. And I'm guessing the three of y'all were there that day. I wondered if you could share with, the future interventional cardiologist, the human side of what that day was like for y'all.
You know, as Andreas was very interested in patient outcomes, and really was insistent that, we try to get perfect outcomes, and extremely unhappy with the procedure that failed, or if the patient had an abrupt closure, had to go to surgery afterwards, that sort of stuff. So we were really busy. Andreas had reached a point in his career where he had enough money and enough time that he wanted to back off just a little bit. So he would frequently, he got a house, and he had a nice house in Buckhead, and he got a house in Sea Island. And so frequently he would do cases Thursday morning and then fly down to Sea Island Thursday afternoon and come back either Sunday afternoon or maybe Monday. And so when he was working, he was very busy, but he was beginning to take a little bit more time off. And so he left on a Thursday. He had done a patient that morning, I think a LAD, and the patient crashed in the afternoon. I took the patient back. So he called to check on it. And I said, we took the patient back and patient actually did fine. It was not it was an easy case, fortunately. And things happened at the right time when the cath lab was opened. And so the patient did quite well, but he was extraordinarily upset about it. And he said, well, tell the patient I'll be back Sunday. And so he was in Sea Island. His technique for getting to Sea Island initially was a fast car. So he had a fancy Jaguar, I think it was, some really fast, sleek, nice looking car. Then he graduated to an airplane. So he would fly to Sea Island and then in his plane and then fly back, Sunday night or Monday morning, that sort of thing. So he said, tell the patient I'll be back and see the patient, we'll be back Sunday. He was in Sea Island. Storm was coming through. So it's really not clear to me whether he was totally aware of the storm coming through or not. But he decided to fly back, and storm came through, and there was some wind, and the plane crashed. He was killed. He and Margaret, and so tragic sort of event that happened. And it's so all the interventional cardiologists around the world, general cardiologists, were totally aware of that horrible day in which Andreas was killed.
Well, so he had 3 or 4 cases on for Monday. And so I got a call in the morning saying, where's Andreas? And I said, what do you mean? And the cath lab said, well, he's not here. I said, well, you should call his house. So he called his secretary, said that she'd call the house. There was no action. And I said, well, where is he? She said, well, he was at Sea Island. So I got on the phone and called the airport down there at Brunswick, at Sea Island, at St. Simon's. And the people there put me in touch with the FAA, somebody, and then they said you needed to call the sheriff of Monroe County, near Forsyth, Georgia, between Forsyth and Macon, and because something's happened. So I called there. I had the tail numbers on its plane. They said, yes, there's been some accident down here. They said, you better come down. And so I went down there. They had not gotten there yet. They had to cut their way through several hundred yards of forest to get to where the plane was. And it had crashed just north of Macon. His wife that he had married a couple of years before was with him in the plane. She was from Macon. I'm from Macon, so I knew her parents. So I had to go and talk to her parents, and then call Andreas's mother and his assistant and Michaela, his first wife. So that was extraordinarily traumatic day. But as John has mentioned, people came from all over. Yeah, came to the funeral. He's buried in Macon, Riverside Cemetery in Macon. His mother came over. His daughters came over, and people ask me about it sometimes. They say, where's the Gruentzig grave down there?" And they ask about that. They ask about Margaret Mitchell being buried in Atlanta. Anyway, so it was enormous loss. John and I, Willis Hurst was very supportive of this whole thing and allowed us to start the Gruentzig Center and then continue recruiting fellows and recruiting, Skip, as you remember, we got a few people that were helped us out a great deal and carried on. And, Andreas's memory will always be there. And I guess none of us would have been doing this kind of work unless somebody had started it. Everybody said, what would have happened if Gruentzig hadn't done this? I said, well, I said this recently about Elaine Cribier, who just died. Somebody would have started balloon valvuloplasty. Somebody would have started TAVI. Somebody would have started angioplasty sometime, somewhere, who knows where. But it's like everything else. Only one person did that, and that was Andreas.
Thanks for sharing that, guys. I know that's
Great.
probably a tough story, and we appreciate y'all sharing it. So on behalf of the SCAI Past Presidents Advisory Council, SCAI, myself, Dr. Skip Anderson, Dr. Douglas, and Dr. King, we want to thank you so much for participating in this today. And we thank those out there in the video world watching this. We'll be back later with another installment of Pioneers in Interventional Cardiology. Thank you all both so much for sharing today with us and for your unbelievable leadership in interventional cardiology.